Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Grandmother Eloise passed away on a Friday morning in April 2024. By Sunday afternoon, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom closet, surrounded by entire decades of her life stored in cardboard boxes. My mother had asked me to help her go through her things because she could barely enter the house without breaking down in tears. I was 26 years old, freshly out of a failed engagement, and temporarily living at my parents' house in rural Virginia. I had nothing but time on my hands. Grandma and I had always been very close, the kind of close where she called me her little accomplice every time we sneaked away to eat extra dessert before dinner. She had lived alone in that old farmhouse for 11 years after Grandpa Harold died, refusing to move even though everyone worried about her. The house smelled like her lavender hand cream and old books. Going through her belongings felt like reading her diary without permission. I expected to find old recipes, maybe some love letters from Grandpa, perhaps photographs from her years as a school teacher. What I did not expect was for my entire idea of who she had been to collapse over the course of a single afternoon. The first boxes contained exactly what anyone would have imagined. Report cards she had kept from students who had written sweet notes on the back. Christmas cards dating back to the 1970s. Receipts she had saved for no logical reason. I was even smiling, shaking my head at how she had collected rubber bands inside a glass jar as if they were precious stones. Then I pulled a shoebox from the deepest part of her closet, hidden behind a stack of quilts she had sewn herself. It was heavier than it should have been, and the lid was secured with a thick rubber band that had almost stuck to the cardboard. When I finally managed to open it, I found a bundle of documents wrapped in a faded silk scarf, the kind with hand-rolled edges that women wore in old Hollywood movies. On top was a marriage certificate, yellowed and brittle, dated June 1961. The bride's name was Eloise Marie Compton, my grandmother's maiden name. But the groom was not Harold Ruston, the man I had called Grandpa my entire life. The name, carefully written in black letters, was Vincent Agostino. Seeing it there made me feel as if I had just fallen through a trapdoor into a room that was never supposed to exist. I sat there for a long time, staring at that certificate, trying to fit it into the story of my grandmother that I had always known. She had married Grandpa Harold in 1965. I knew that because their anniversary had always been a big event, celebrated with her famous lemon cake and too many candles. But that certificate said she had been married 4 years earlier to a man none of us had ever heard of. I carefully unfolded the rest of the documents in the bundle, leaving my fingerprints on papers that had not been touched in decades. There were photographs, small and square with scalloped edges, the kind people used to take in photo booths. My grandmother looked unbelievably young, maybe 19 or 20, with set waves in her dark hair and red lipstick that looked almost black in the photo. Beside her stood a man with slicked back hair, a sharp jaw, and eyes that seemed to be holding secrets even in a simple snapshot. He was handsome in a dangerous way, the kind of handsome mothers warn their daughters about. On the back of one of the photos, written in my grandmother's careful cursive, were the words, "Vincent and me, Coney Island, June 1961. Under the photographs, I found newspaper clippings, fragile and brown around the edges, folded into small squares as if someone had been hiding them for a very long time. The first was from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, dated March 1963. The headline read, "Local businessmen wanted for questioning in warehouse fire." There was no photograph, but the article mentioned Vincent Agostino, 24 years old, allegedly connected to the Morano crime family, which operated out of Red Hook. 3 men had died in that fire. The article said investigators suspected arson, that the warehouse had been used as a front for illegal gambling operations, and that Agostino had not been seen since the night of the blaze. I read it 3 times, hoping the words would change, hoping another Vincent Agostino would appear, a different man with the same name, a coincidence that would allow me to keep the image of my grandmother intact. But the next clipping was worse. It was from 2 weeks later. A smaller article tucked away on page 6 reported that Vincent Agostino was now considered a missing person. His car had been found abandoned near the Staten Island docks. The doors were open and the keys were still in the ignition. There was blood on the front seat. He was never seen again. After that, my hands seemed to move on their own, pulling out more papers, more secrets. There was a handwritten letter on plain white paper. No envelope, no date. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, completely different from my grandmother's elegant script. It said, "Ellie, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't look for me. Don't ask questions. Forget you ever knew my name. They will come asking, and you must tell them nothing. You were never my wife. We never met. Burn this letter and everything else. I'm sorry for what I brought into your life." Vincent. She had not burned it. She had kept it for more than 60 years, hidden in that shoebox along with her marriage certificate, those photographs, and those terrible newspaper clippings. I tried to imagine her young, barely 22 years old, receiving that letter, understanding that her husband was dead or running for his life, and that she could never speak of him again. I tried to imagine the fear she must have felt, the grief she could not share with anyone, the weight of pretending he had never existed. At the bottom of the shoebox, underneath everything else, I found a small spiral notebook with a faded green cover. It was a kind of journal, though not exactly. It seemed more like a collection of scattered notes written in my grandmother's handwriting at different points over many years. The first entry was dated April 1963, just a few weeks after Vincent's disappearance. Men came to the apartment today, 2 of them. They asked about Vincent. I told them I didn't know anyone by that name. They didn't believe me. One of them grabbed my wrist so hard he left bruises. They said they would come back. I turned the page with trembling fingers. May 1963. I moved to Virginia, took back my Compton name, and told everyone I was a widow, that my husband died in Korea. No one questions a war widow. The entries continued, sparse but devastating. In 1965, she wrote about meeting Harold, a kind man who worked at the post office and brought her flowers every Sunday. In 1967, she wrote about their wedding, about how happy she was, about how she had finally begun to feel safe. But then in 1971, another entry appeared. A man came to the school today. He said he was looking for an old friend named Elia Gugustino. I told him there was no one here by that name. He smiled at me before leaving. He knew. They still know. I kept reading, unable to stop, each entry dragging me deeper into a life whose existence I had known nothing about. The notes were not frequent. Sometimes years passed between one and the next, but together they painted a picture of constant and silent terror. In 1978, she wrote about a black sedan that parked in front of her house for 3 days in a row before finally leaving. She never told Harold. In 1985, when my mother was a teenager, someone broke into her car and rummaged through the glove compartment, but took nothing of value. They were looking for something, my grandmother wrote, or they were sending a message. I don't know which is worse. In 1993, she received a condolence card in the mail after her own mother's funeral. It was unsigned, postmarked from Brooklyn, and inside someone had written only, "Our condolences to the Agostino family." She had kept that card too, pressed between the pages of the notebook like a dried flower, a reminder of a threat that never fully disappeared. That was when I understood that my grandmother had spent her entire adult life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to finally catch up with her. The last entry in the notebook was dated only 3 years earlier, in 2022. By then, my grandmother's handwriting had become shaky, the letters crooked and uneven in a way that tightened my chest. I am 83 years old and I still check the locks twice every night. I still watch every unfamiliar car that comes down our driveway. Harold has been dead for more than a decade, and I am alone with this secret, just as I always knew I would be. Sometimes I think about telling the children, about leaving this box for them to find when I am gone. But what good would that do? The men who killed Vincent are probably dead by now, too. The Moranos are gone, dismantled by the FBI in the 80s. There is no one left to fear. And still I am afraid. I have been afraid for 60 years, and I do not know how to stop feeling it. Maybe when I die, the fear will finally die with me. Maybe that is the only way this ends. I closed the notebook, pressed it against my chest, and sat there in my dead grandmother's closet, crying for the terrified young woman she had been and for all the years she had spent carrying that weight alone. I do not know how long I stayed in that closet. The light coming through the bedroom window had changed from afternoon gold to the soft gray of early evening when I finally managed to pull myself together. I placed everything back inside the shoebox: the certificate, the photographs, the clippings, the letter, the notebook. Then I carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. My mother would be back the next morning to keep going through the house, and I had to make a decision. Should I tell her? Should I show her that box and watch her entire understanding of her own mother collapse the same way mine had? Grandmother Eloise had kept that secret for more than 60 years. She had protected her family from that knowledge, had carried that burden alone so they would never have to live with the same fear she did. Part of me wanted to honor that sacrifice, to take the box to the backyard and burn it, just as Vincent had asked her to do all those years ago. But another part of me, a louder part, needed to know more. I needed to understand what had really happened to Vincent Agostino, and whether the threat my grandmother had feared her entire life had ever been real. I spent that night sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, falling into an endless pit of old newspaper archives, genealogy pages, and true crime forums dedicated to mid-century New York organized crime. The Morano family had been real, a small but violent organization that operated out of Brooklyn from the late 1940s until the FBI dismantled it in 1987. They were known for illegal gambling, loan sharking, and arsons for hire. Vincent Agostino's name appeared in a few digitized court documents from the era, identified as a known associate, though he was never formally charged with anything. His disappearance in March 1963 was mentioned in a true crime book about unsolved mob killings, an excerpt of which someone had posted on a forum. The author speculated that Vincent had been killed by the Moranos for skimming money, or that he had been an informant eliminated before he could testify. Either way, his body was never found. There was no closure, no resolution, only a young man who entered the fog of history and never returned. And my grandmother, barely out of her teens, had been married to him for less than 2 years before he disappeared. She had spent the rest of her life waiting for the people who killed him to come for her too. Around 2 in the morning, I found something that made me lean back in my chair and stare at the screen for a long time. It was a photograph inside a digitized FBI file on the Morano investigation, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act. The image was grainy, black and white, and showed a group of men standing outside a social club in Red Hook sometime in the early 1960s. Most of the faces were labeled with names I did not recognize, soldiers and associates who had long since died or been imprisoned. But in one corner of the frame, partially cut off, there was a young man in a dark coat looking directly at the camera. The label beneath him read, Vincent Agostino, unconfirmed. I zoomed in as much as the resolution allowed, and even through the wear of time and the blurred pixels, I recognized the sharp jaw, the slick-back hair, those eyes that seemed to be holding secrets. It was him. It really was him. My grandmother had married that man, had shared a bed with him, had probably loved him in that desperate way young people love before they understand how much love can cost. And he had walked out of her life into a world of violence and shadows, never to return. That night I decided to keep the shoebox. I did not burn it, and I did not show it to my mother. Not right away, at least. Instead, I put it in the trunk of my car, drove back to my parents' house, and spent the following weeks trying to figure out what to do with the weight of what I had discovered. Eventually, I did tell my mother. I waited until a quiet Sunday afternoon when my father had gone out to play golf and sat her down at the kitchen table. I opened the box in front of her. She cried, of course. She asked questions I could not answer. She looked at the photographs of her mother as a young bride and said she did not recognize the woman in them. But she also said something that has stayed with me ever since. She said, "All those years I thought she was simply anxious. I thought she was paranoid for no reason. but she was protecting us. She was carrying all of this so we would never have to. Together, we decided to keep the secret within our immediate family. There was no point in telling my aunts and uncles. There was no reason to destroy the image they had of grandmother Eloise when she had worked so hard to build it. The Moranos no longer existed. Vincent was gone. The only person who was still afraid was gone too. We let the fear die with her, just as she had hoped it would. I still have the shoebox. It is now on the top shelf of my closet, behind a stack of old yearbooks and college photo albums. Sometimes late at night, when I cannot sleep, I take it down and go through its contents again. I study the photographs of my grandmother when she was young, trying to find some trace of the fear that would eventually define her life. But all I see is hope. She looks so unbelievably young in those pictures, so full of the belief that love can conquer everything. She did not yet know who Vincent was or what he would bring into her life. She did not know she would spend the next 6 decades checking locks, watching cars, and flinching at unexpected knocks on the door. I think about her a lot now. Not the grandmother I knew, with her lemon cake and lavender hand cream, but the frightened young woman who completely reinvented herself just to survive. She built an entire life out of silence and secrets, and she did it so well that none of us ever suspected a thing. I do not know if that makes her a brave woman, a tragic woman, or both, but I know this. She loved us enough to carry that weight alone, and she was strong enough not to let it destroy her. That is the woman I choose to remember. That is the grandmother I will always love. Story 2. A cream-colored envelope changed everything, although I did not know that yet when I pulled it from the mailbox 5 days after burying Dad. March of 2017 had been, up to that point, the worst month of my life. My father died of a heart attack in his recliner, alone in the Rochester apartment where he had raised my sister and me after our mother left. I was 24 years old, working at a small accounting firm downtown, and my sister Tessa had just turned 22. She was still finishing her nursing degree while working night shifts at an assisted living facility. We were broke, shattered by grief, and completely unprepared to deal with all the logistics that come with death. Dad never talked about what he wanted for his funeral. He never talked about money. In truth, he never talked about anything personal. His past was the one subject guaranteed to make him leave the room. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. As far as we knew, none of them existed. He raised us as if he had appeared out of nowhere, a man without a history, and we had stopped asking questions years ago because the silence that followed hurt too much. The letter inside that envelope came from Scottsdale, Arizona. It was written in elegant cursive on thick paper that smelled faintly of lavender. A woman named Lorraine Prescott claimed to be our grandmother, our father's mother, someone whose existence he had hidden from us our entire lives. She wrote that she and her husband Donald had been searching for us for years, that our father had cut off all contact when he left home decades earlier, and that they had never understood why. She had learned of his death after finding his obituary during an internet search, and her letter was filled with grief, regret, and an almost desperate hope. At the end, she included a phone number and a photograph of 2 silver-haired people standing in front of a beautiful Adobe-style house surrounded by desert flowers. I remember holding that photo under the dim kitchen light, boxes stacked around me, searching for something familiar in their faces. The woman had Dad's jaw, that same stubborn firmness. The man had his forehead, broad and marked with wrinkles. Tessa came up behind me and looked at the picture without saying anything for a long time. We had family out there, real family, and they wanted to meet us. Tessa was the one who called them first. She had always had more courage than I did, more willingness to take risks, and I think grief had left her hungry for connection in a way I did not fully understand at the time. Lorraine answered on the second ring and immediately started crying. It was a soft, broken sound that made my sister's eyes fill with tears too. They talked for almost an hour that first night, while I sat on the couch pretending to sort through old bills, listening to Tessa describe our childhood, our father, the life we had lived without knowing they existed. Lorraine sounded warm and sweet. She asked questions about our jobs, our health, our dreams for the future. She kept repeating how much we looked like our father, how happy she was to finally hear our voices. By the time Tessa hung up, she was convinced they were good people who had been hurt by a son and capable of forgiving whatever had happened between them. I wanted to believe it too. We were orphans now, without either of our parents, and the idea of having grandparents felt like a lifeline in the middle of a dark ocean. Over the following weeks, the calls became routine. Sometimes we spoke with Lorraine, other times with Donald, and occasionally with both of them on speakerphone. They wanted to know everything: our favorite foods, our allergies, whether we had experienced any health problems growing up. Lorraine mentioned that heart disease ran in the family and urged us to get medical checkups. She said that now that our father was gone, she worried about us. Donald talked about his own health issues, about a kidney disease that required him to undergo dialysis 3 times a week, and about how grateful he was for modern medicine. They offered to help us with the debts our father had left behind and sent us a check for $5,000 that arrived in a padded envelope, along with another handwritten note. We deposited it, feeling guilty and relieved at the same time. When they invited us to visit them in Arizona for a week, all expenses paid, Tessa accepted before I could even think of a reason to hesitate. A part of me felt uneasy. There was a small voice asking me why Dad had cut ties with these people so completely, but I silenced it. I told myself he had simply been a difficult man, someone who held grudges. I told myself we deserved this chance to have a family again. We flew into Phoenix on a Friday afternoon in late April, and Donald picked us up at the airport in a silver Mercedes that still smelled like a new car. He was thinner than he had been in the photograph, and his skin had a grayish tone that I now recognize as the look of someone whose kidneys are failing. Even so, his handshake was firm and his smile seemed genuine, wrinkling the corners of his pale blue eyes as he loaded our bags into the trunk. Lorraine was waiting for us at the house with a table full of enough food to feed 10 people. Homemade lasagna, fresh bread, and a chocolate cake that, according to her, had been our father's favorite when he was a boy. Their house was even more beautiful than the photo had suggested. Everything was terracotta tile, high ceilings, and windows that looked out toward the desert mountains. They had prepared a guest room for each of us, decorated with fresh flowers, soft towels, and small baskets of toiletries. Everything felt too perfect, like a movie set designed to make us feel welcome. But I attributed it to their money and their excitement. They were people with resources, and they wanted to impress the granddaughters they had never met. The first 2 days were wonderful, or at least they seemed that way on the surface. Lorraine took us shopping and bought Tessa a turquoise necklace that cost more than my monthly rent. Donald showed us his collection of antique cars in the garage, 5 gleaming vehicles that he polished himself every Sunday morning. They told us stories about our father when he was a child, how he loved baseball and hated vegetables, how he spent hours in his room building model airplanes. I learned that he had a dog named Chester who died when he was 12, and that he cried for an entire week. Those details caused me a deep ache for the man I had lost, but they also made me angry at him for hiding all of it from us. On the second night, Donald casually mentioned that he had scheduled appointments for us at his personal doctor's office on Monday morning. Just routine checkups, he said, since we were in town and it was important to know our family medical history. Of course, he would cover all expenses. Lorraine nodded and added that the doctor could run some blood tests, check our kidney and liver function, and make sure we were in good shape. Tessa thanked them without hesitation. I did not say anything, but something cold settled in my chest, something I did not know how to name at the time. Monday morning came, and Donald drove us to a medical complex on the east side of Scottsdale, a sleek building with tinted windows and a lobby that looked more like a luxury hotel than a clinic. The doctor, a tall man named Dr. Ashford, with a silver goatee and an expensive watch, greeted Donald like an old friend. They shook hands and chatted briefly about golf, while Tessa and I sat in the waiting room filling out forms. The documents asked in great detail about our medical history, surgeries, medications, family illnesses going back 3 generations. There was an entire section about organ donation preferences and whether we had ever undergone tissue compatibility testing. I stared at those words for a long time, my pen suspended over the page. When I asked the receptionist why they needed that information for a routine checkup, she smiled and said it was standard procedure, that there was nothing to worry about. Dr. Ashford called us in one at a time. He examined me very carefully, more thoroughly than any doctor had ever examined me before. He took my blood pressure, listened to my heart, pressed my abdomen with cold fingers. He drew 6 tubes of blood and asked me for a urine sample. Before I left, he mentioned that he wanted to schedule an ultrasound of my kidneys for later in the week, just to establish a baseline for the future. I found Tessa in the waiting room, pale and quiet, her arm bandaged from her own blood draw. She told me Dr. Ashford had asked her strange questions, things like whether she smoked or drank heavily, whether she had ever had hepatitis, whether she would ever consider being a living donor someday if a family member needed help. She laughed when she told me, saying he was probably just being thorough, but her laugh sounded empty. On the drive back to the house, Donald talked about how important family was, about how blood relatives had a responsibility to care for one another, about how his own brother had saved his life years earlier by donating bone marrow when Donald had leukemia. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat, nodding from time to time and occasionally watching us in the rearview mirror with an expression I could not decipher. That night I stayed awake in my guest room, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning above me, replaying every conversation we had had since that first letter arrived. The questions about our health, the insistence on checkups, Donald's kidney disease, the forms about tissue compatibility. An image was beginning to form in my mind. It was horrible, impossible, and I wanted with all my strength to be wrong. The next morning I woke up early before anyone else in the house was moving. Then I did something I am not proud of. I went into Donald's study, a wood-paneled room at the end of the hall that he had briefly shown us on the first day, and searched his desk. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and every creak of the floor made me flinch. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of financial documents and old photographs, I found a folder with our names on it. Inside were printouts of our social media profiles, screenshots of posts from years earlier, a timeline of our lives reconstructed from public information. There were notes in Lorraine's handwriting about our jobs, our addresses, our relationship statuses, and there was a letter from a transplant center in Phoenix, dated 2 months before our father died, informing Donald that he had been moved up on the kidney transplant waiting list, but that a living donor would greatly increase his chances and reduce the waiting time. One highlighted section stated that first-degree relatives, especially young and healthy adults, were the ideal candidates. My hands went numb. I could not feel my fingers as I put everything back exactly the way I had found it. I spent the rest of the day pretending nothing had changed. I smiled through breakfast, nodded at Lorraine's stories about her gardening club, and watched Donald with entirely new eyes as he moved slowly through the house. Every kind gesture now felt like manipulation. Every warm word sounded like a transaction. That afternoon, Lorraine suggested that we look through family photo albums together. I sat on the couch between her and Tessa while she turned to page after page of faded photographs. There was our father as a baby, as a toddler, as a gap-toothed boy squinting in the sun. And then, around age 15, the photos stopped. Lorraine's voice tightened when she reached those empty pages. She said our father had changed when he was a teenager, that he became distant and angry, and that one day he simply left and never came back. I asked her why. What had happened? She exchanged a look with Donald that lasted half a second too long. She said she had never understood, that some children simply reject their parents for no reason. But I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a shadow of something she was not willing to tell us. That night, while Tessa was in the shower, I brought her into my room and told her everything I had found. She looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Then slowly, horribly, her face fell as she realized I was telling her the truth. We left the next morning. I told Lorraine that Tessa had received a call from work, an emergency at the care facility that required her to return early, and that we needed to take the first available flight. Lorraine's face did something strange when I said it, a flash of panic that quickly softened into concern. She insisted on driving us to the airport herself and said Donald was not feeling well enough to make the trip. The drive was unbearable. 40 minutes of small talk and tense silences while my sister squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers. At the terminal, Lorraine hugged us both and told us she loved us, that she hoped we would come back soon. That family was the most important thing in the world. Her perfume smelled like lavender, the same scent as that first letter, and it turned my stomach. As we passed through the sliding doors into the airport, I looked back and saw her standing beside the car, watching us with an expression that still haunts me. It was not sadness. It was not disappointment. It was calculation. The look of someone already planning her next move. We did not speak until after we got through security. Then Tessa started crying and could not stop for the entire flight home. We never went back to Arizona. We never answered another call from that Scottsdale number. Lorraine sent letters for months, each one more desperate than the last, talking about how much they missed us, how Donald's health was getting worse, how they only wanted to help us and be part of our lives. One of the letters mentioned that Dr. Ashford had called with our results and wanted to speak with us urgently. Another included a check for $10,000 and a note saying it was an early inheritance, with no conditions attached. We tore up the checks and burned the letters in the backyard of our father's old apartment, watching the paper curl and blacken inside a metal trash can. Tessa and I talk about it sometimes, late at night, when neither of us can sleep, trying to understand what kind of people would track down their estranged granddaughters for their organs. We think about our father, at 15 years old, somehow discovering what his parents were capable of and running as far away as he could. Now we understand why he never talked about his past, why he raised us like a man without a history. He was protecting us in the only way he knew how. I still wonder whether Donald ever got his kidney, whether some other desperate relative or some stranger saved his life. I wonder if Lorraine is still out there, searching obituaries for other relatives, other possible donors. Some nights I dream about that house in the desert, with its terracotta tiles and high ceilings, and I wake up with the feeling that I escaped something I will never fully understand. My father saved us twice, once by running away, and again by dying before they could reach us through him. I wish I could thank him for that. I wish I could tell him I finally understand. Story 3. No one in my family wanted to deal with Grandpa Warren's house after the funeral, so the task ended up falling to me. I was 34 years old, recently divorced, sleeping on a friend's couch in Harrisburg, and technically unemployed, which apparently made me the perfect candidate. The old man had lived alone in that house in rural Pennsylvania for more than 40 years, accumulating everything he had ever touched. The house had to be cleared out before the estate sale scheduled for April. I drove there on a Friday morning in March 2023, thinking it would maybe take me about 2 weeks to finish the job. The house smelled exactly the way I remembered from my childhood visits. That mixture of old wood, mothballs, and something slightly metallic that I had always associated with the basement. The same floral wallpaper in the kitchen. The same grandfather clock in the hallway stopped at 3:47 for as long as I could remember. I started upstairs with the easier things, clothes, books, and old photo albums. But I knew the basement was going to be the real nightmare. Everyone in the family knew about the basement. Grandpa had been putting things down there since the early 1980s. I spent the first 2 days simply opening pathways through the clutter. Broken furniture, useless appliances, towers of magazines and newspapers that reached the ceiling in some places. My aunt had warned me it would be bad, but I had no idea. By Wednesday afternoon, I had finally managed to reach the back of the basement, beyond the old furnace that groaned every time the heat kicked on. That was when I noticed something strange. A section of the back wall, maybe 6 feet wide, was completely blocked by a thick canvas tarp and a stack of wooden crates. When I dragged the crates aside, I discovered there was a door behind them. It was not an ordinary interior door, but a thick metal door. like the kind you might see on a storage unit secured with a heavy padlock. The padlock was old but solid. There was no rust on it, which meant someone had been taking care of it. I went upstairs and searched Grandpa's desk for almost an hour until I found a small brass key inside an envelope. The envelope only said storage, written in his careful handwriting. I remember my palms were damp when I slipped the key into the padlock. I assumed there were probably valuables inside, maybe antiques or cash he did not trust banks with. I had no idea what I was about to find. The door opened more easily than I expected, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was not rot or mold, but something clinical, like rubbing alcohol mixed with old paper. I used my phone flashlight to search for a light chain. When the bare bulb flickered on, I saw a room about the size of a one-car garage. The walls were lined with metal shelving, the industrial kind you see in warehouses, and every shelf was filled with boxes. Cardboard file boxes, the kind you buy at office supply stores. Each one had a white label on the front. The labels had dates. That was the first thing I noticed. Dates going back decades. 1987, 1991, 1994, 2003, 2011. They were not in order, but scattered across the shelves. And there had to be at least 30 or 40 boxes in there. In the center of the room was a wooden desk with an old lamp on it, the kind with a green glass shade, and a chair that looked like it had been used thousands of times. The seat cushion was worn down to almost nothing. I stood in the doorway for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. My first thought was that Grandpa had some kind of side business. Maybe he did taxes or legal paperwork for people in town. That would have made sense. That would have been fine. I took down the first box I could reach, one marked 1994, and placed it on the desk. Inside were folders, maybe a dozen of them, each packed with papers. I opened the first one and found newspaper clippings. They were yellowed and brittle, carefully cut out and stored in plastic sleeves. The headlines tightened my throat. Woman found dead near creek. No suspects. Police baffled by brutal murder in Westmoreland County. Body discovered in Woodard area. Investigation ongoing. Every clipping was about a murder. Unsolved murders. I turned the pages of the folder, and there must have been 15 or 20 articles in there. All from different newspapers. All from 1994. All about homicides that had never been solved. At the bottom of the folder, beneath all the clippings, there was a small Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a silver charm bracelet, a little heart with the letter M engraved on it. I stared at it. My mind tried to build an explanation. Maybe Grandpa had been interested in true crime, like those people who follow cold cases as a hobby. Maybe he collected these things because he wanted to help somehow. But that bracelet was not a newspaper clipping. It was something real, something someone had worn on their wrist. I opened another folder from the same box. More clippings, more unsolved cases, and another Ziploc bag at the bottom. This one contained a keychain, one of those cheap plastic ones with a space for a photograph. The photo inside showed a young woman with dark hair smiling at the camera. She seemed to be at a party or a cookout, holding a red cup. I set it aside and opened the next folder. A man's watch with a silver band stopped at 2:17. The next folder had a single earring, gold with a small green stone. Every folder had something like that at the end. Personal objects, things that had belonged to people. I could feel my heart pounding so hard that it made my vision pulse. I took down another box, this one from 2003, and it was the same. Clippings about murders in different Pennsylvania counties, sometimes from Ohio or West Virginia. And always those little bags with objects inside. A wedding ring, a hair clip, a set of keys. I counted 8 boxes before I had to stop and sit in that old chair. The seat was so worn down that I could feel the wooden frame underneath. I sat there trying to breathe, trying to think of any explanation that did not lead where my mind was already going. Then I noticed the desk drawer. It was locked, but the same brass key from the envelope upstairs opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all Polaroids, the old kind with white borders. The first one I picked up showed a crime scene. Yellow police tape, officers standing around, and a shape on the ground covered with a white sheet. The photo had been taken from far away behind a line of trees, as if someone had been watching from the woods. I moved to the next one. Another crime scene, another location, the same angle. Someone standing at the edge, watching, photographing. There were at least 50 Polaroids in that drawer, and every single one was a photograph of a crime scene taken from outside the official perimeter. Some showed the bodies before they were covered. I recognized one of the places from a newspaper clipping I had just seen, a wooded area near a creek in Westmoreland County. The article said the body had been found by a hiker on a Sunday morning in September 1994. The Polaroid showed the same site, the same body, but from an angle the police photos would never have captured. Whoever took those photographs had been there. They had been watching. I do not know how long I stayed in that room. An hour, maybe more. At some point my phone died, and I did not even notice. I went upstairs to charge it and splash water on my face, and that was when I saw the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. Grandpa had used the same kind of calendar for as long as I could remember. Those big ones with a square for each day where appointments and plans are written down. He had an entire stack of old calendars in a kitchen drawer, accumulated over the years. I do not know what made me start going through them. Maybe I already knew. Maybe I just needed to see it for myself. I pulled out the 1994 calendar and went to September. On the weekend before that woman was found near the creek, there was a note written in Grandpa's handwriting. Fishing trip. Back Monday. I took the newspaper clipping from the basement and checked the date. The woman was found on Sunday, September 18th. According to his calendar, Grandpa had been on a fishing trip that entire weekend. He had left Friday and returned Monday. I felt sick. I grabbed another calendar, the one from 2003, and cross-checked it with the clippings from that box. Every time, with every murder, there was a note about Grandpa being out of town. Fishing trip, visiting cousin in Erie, hardware convention in Pittsburgh, church retreat. I spent the next 3 hours going through every calendar I could find and comparing them with the dates on those boxes. 17 years of calendars, and the pattern did not fail a single time. Whenever there was a murder in the clippings, Grandpa was always away that weekend. He always had some excuse written in his neat handwriting. I started making a list on a sheet of paper, 2 columns, one for the date of the murder and one for his alibi. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I had 23 entries, 23 unsolved murders across 3 states, 23 weekends when my grandfather was supposedly fishing, visiting relatives, or attending some event. I thought about calling the police right then. I had the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the keypad, but I did not. I could not. This was the man who taught me how to ride a bike, the man who took me to baseball games, bought me ice cream, and sat with me when I had nightmares. I needed more. I had to be completely sure before destroying his memory, before telling my mother that her father was a monster. So I kept searching. At the bottom of the desk drawer, beneath all the Polaroids, there was a leather notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, as if it had been handled 1,000 times. I opened it and found page after page of handwritten notes, all in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Dates, places, names. Some entries were only a few lines. April 14th, 1991. Route 30, rest area near Greensburg. Woman, late 20s, brown hair, blue Toyota in parking lot, alone. Other entries were longer, more detailed. Physical descriptions, habits, the time someone left work, went running, or walked their dog. I understood that I was looking at surveillance notes. He had been watching those people, studying them, learning their routines. The notebook continued for more than 100 pages, and not every entry had a corresponding newspaper clipping. Some were just notes, simple observations, people he had watched but maybe never acted on, or maybe people whose bodies were never found. I thought I was going to vomit. In fact, I leaned over the desk expecting it to happen, but nothing came out. My body simply shook. I had to put my head between my knees and focus on breathing until the room stopped spinning. When I finally looked up again, I noticed something I had missed before. On the wall behind the desk, partially hidden by one of the shelves, there was a map. It was a large map of Pennsylvania and the surrounding states, pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. It had marks on it. Red dots, dozens of them, scattered across the region. Some had small dates written beside them in black ink. I recognized several places from the newspaper clippings. Westmoreland County, a point near the Ohio border, somewhere in the northern mountains. Every red dot was a place where someone had died. I stared at that map for a long time, counting the dots. There were more dots than boxes on the shelves, many more. Some of the oldest dots, the ones from the 80s, were so faded they looked almost pink. He had been doing this for decades, maybe since before I was born, maybe since before my mother was born. I thought about every family dinner, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving when Grandpa sat at the head of the table, carved the turkey, and told jokes that made everyone laugh. I thought about how he called me champ and ruffled my hair, how he smelled like pipe tobacco and mint. That man, that monster, had been hiding in plain sight for my entire life, and no one had ever suspected a thing. I left the room and locked the door behind me. I sat on the basement stairs for what felt like hours, staring at the concrete floor, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to burn it all, carry those boxes outside, pour gasoline over them, and watch decades of horror turn to ash. No one would ever know. Grandpa would remain the kind old man in everyone's memory, and I would carry that secret until my death. But then I thought about the objects inside the Ziploc bags. The bracelet with the letter M, the keychain with the smiling woman, the wedding ring. All of those things had belonged to real people, people with families who never got answers, who never had closure, who spent years wondering what had happened to their daughter, their sister, or their wife. I could not take that from them. I could not let Grandpa win one more time. So I called the police. I sat there on those basement stairs, dialed 911, and told the operator that I had found something in my grandfather's house, something connected to old crimes, and that I needed someone to come look at it. The sheriff's deputy who arrived probably thought I was crazy at first, a guy babbling about boxes, murder clippings, and a secret room. But then I showed him. I watched his face change when he opened those folders and saw the Polaroids in the map. He made some calls, and in less than 2 hours, the house was full of state police and FBI agents. That was almost 2 years ago. I am still not allowed to talk about the details of the investigation, but I can share what became public knowledge. They linked objects from those boxes to 14 unsolved murders in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. 14 families finally learned what had happened to their loved ones. Investigators told me there are probably more cases from the 1970s and early 1980s, but in some of them the evidence is too degraded to establish a definite connection. My mother stopped speaking to me after the story came out in the news. She says I destroyed her father's memory for nothing, that I must have misunderstood what I found, that there has to be another explanation. There is not. I know what I saw in that room. I know what those calendars said. Some nights I still dream about that map on the wall, all those faded red dots spreading across 3 states like a disease. I think about the fact that he died peacefully in his sleep at 87 years old, surrounded by his family, without ever answering for any of it. I think about how I used to sit on his lap as a child while he read me bedtime stories. And I wonder how many other families are out there with basements they have never searched, with doors they have never opened, hiding secrets capable of shattering everything they thought they knew. Story 4. Hospital rooms have a particular silence, one that hangs in the air with a weight unlike any other kind of stillness I have ever known. I learned that during my years as a nurse at St. Catherine Memorial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But nothing prepared me for how that silence would feel when the person lying in the bed was my own grandmother. October 2017 was supposed to be a good month for me. I had just gotten engaged to my college boyfriend. We were planning a spring wedding and life seemed to be falling into place exactly the way everyone promises it eventually will. Then my mother called on a Tuesday at 6 in the morning, her voice breaking as she told me that Nana Ruth had collapsed in her kitchen and that the doctors said she might not have much time left. I drove for 3 hours through rain so heavy I could barely see the road. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, and I prayed to a God I was no longer sure I believed in. By the time I arrived, she had already slipped into that in-between state between consciousness and whatever comes next. Her eyes were closed and her breathing was shallow and labored. Nana Ruth was 87 years old, and until that Tuesday morning she had always seemed invincible to me. She still lived alone on the same farm where she had raised my mother. She still tended her garden every spring, still made her famous apple butter every fall, and sent jars to every member of the family. I graduated from nursing school at 23, young and idealistic, convinced that understanding the mechanisms of death would somehow make it easier to face. Sitting beside her bed that Wednesday, holding her hand while my parents took turns pacing the hallway and making phone calls, I understood how wrong I had been. Her skin felt like tissue paper, thin, dry, and fragile in a way that closed my throat every time I looked at her. She had been muttering in her sleep all morning, fragments of sentences that made no sense, names I did not recognize, what sounded like apologies directed at people who were not in the room. I thought it was only the effect of the medication or the confusion that often appears at the end, until her fingers suddenly closed around mine with surprising strength and her eyes flew open. She looked directly at me, and for one instant she was completely lucid, completely present, and completely terrified. She wasn't supposed to come home that night, Nana Ruth whispered, her voice dry and cracked like autumn leaves. I leaned closer, thinking maybe I had misheard her, believing perhaps she was still trapped in some dream from her past. But her eyes were fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to pull away. I have to tell you before I go. I need someone to know. Her grip on my hand tightened even more. Her brittle nails dug into my palm hard enough to leave marks. I looked toward the door, wondering if I should call my mother, but something in Nana's expression stopped me. She looked like a woman who had carried a weight for so long that her own bones had bent around it. And now, at the end of everything, she was desperate to let it fall. I told her it was okay, that she could tell me anything, that I was listening. I had no idea what I was agreeing to hear. She began speaking in a voice so low that I had to bring my ear close to her mouth, close enough to smell her stale breath and the faint chemical scent of the medications dripping into her arm. She told me about a night in the summer of 1987, a night when she was still living in Westboro with my grandfather before he died. She told me about her neighbor, a woman named Donna Whitmore, who lived in a small blue house at the end of Chestnut Road with her husband and their 2 young children. Nana Ruth's voice trembled as she described Donna, a quiet red-haired woman who always wore a silver cross around her neck and brought casseroles to people's homes whenever someone in the neighborhood was sick. She was good, Nana Ruth said, and something about the way she said it tightened my chest. She didn't deserve what happened to her, none of it, and I let them blame the wrong person because I was too afraid to speak. I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs, watching tears slip from the corners of my grandmother's eyes and disappear into the pillow beneath her head. The story came out in fragments, as if she were pulling pieces of glass from a wound that had never fully closed. That summer night in 1987, Donna Whitmore was supposedly visiting her sister in Pittsburgh. Her husband, a man named Gene, had told the entire neighborhood that Donna would be away for the whole weekend. He mentioned it at the hardware store at the diner to anyone who would listen. Nana Ruth said she remembered thinking it was strange how much he repeated it, as if he wanted to make sure everyone knew the house would be empty, except for him and the children. She was sitting on the porch that Friday afternoon, shelling peas into a metal bowl, when she saw someone walking up the path toward the Whitmore house. It was not Gene. It was a man she recognized from church, someone named Lloyd Becker, who worked at the sawmill outside town and had been seen talking quietly with Gene for weeks before that night. Lloyd was carrying something wrapped in a dark cloth, something long and heavy. and he walked with a determination that made Nana Ruth set aside her bowl of peas and watch. She told me she almost called out to him, that she almost asked what he was doing there when Jean's wife was supposed to be away. But something stopped her. A feeling in her stomach, a warning she could not name, the certainty that she was seeing something she was not meant to see. She watched Lloyd disappear around the back of the Whitmore house and told herself it was none of her business, that he was probably there to help Jean with some project, that there was nothing strange about a man visiting his friend on a Friday evening. She went inside, made dinner for my grandfather, and tried to forget the way Lloyd had been walking, the way he carried his shoulders hunched as if he were preparing himself for something. Nearly at midnight, she heard the screams. Even 30 years later, lying in that hospital bed, Nana Ruth's face twisted as she described the sound. Raw, animal, the kind of scream that does not seem human because human beings should not be able to feel that much pain. The scream stopped after a few minutes. Then came the sirens, and then the flashing lights of police cruisers lit the whole street red and blue. Donna Whitmore had come home early from Pittsburgh because her sister had gotten sick. She was not supposed to be there, but she was. The police concluded it had been a burglary gone wrong. Donna had surprised an intruder, they said, someone who panicked and attacked her before fleeing into the night. Jean played the part of the devastated husband so well that no one thought to look too closely at him. He cried at the funeral. He hugged his children. He accepted casseroles from the same neighbors who had once received them from his dead wife. But there was a man who lived 2 streets over, a drifter named Terrence Gould, who had only been in town for a few months doing odd jobs and sleeping in a room above the old feed store. Terrence had a record, petty theft, a bar fight that cost him 6 months in the county jail, and he had no alibi for that Friday night because he had been drinking alone in his room. The police found a pawn ticket in his pocket for a silver necklace with a cross pendant, and that was enough. Terrence Gould was arrested, tried, and convicted of Donna Whitmore's murder in less than 8 months. He died in prison in 2003, still swearing he was innocent, still insisting that he had bought that necklace from a man he met outside a bar, and that he had no idea where it had really come from. Nana Ruth's voice broke when she explained why she had never said anything. Lloyd Becker was her brother, her younger brother, the baby of the family, the boy she had helped raise after their mother died when Lloyd was only 6 years old. She had watched him take his first steps, taught him to read, protected him from their father's temper when the old man came home drunk looking for someone to hit. Lloyd was not a good man. She knew that. She had always known that. But he was her blood. And when the police went door to door asking whether anyone had seen anything strange that night, she told them no. She said she had been inside the house all evening, that she had not looked out the window, that she had not seen Lloyd walking toward the Whitmore house with something heavy in his hands. She lied to protect the boy she had raised, and in doing so, condemned an innocent man to die behind bars for a crime he did not commit. "I have carried it every day since," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible now, and her hand was losing strength around mine. "And now I am going to meet my Maker, and I do not know if he will forgive me, but I needed you to know. Someone had to know the truth." She died less than an hour later, fading away so quietly I almost did not notice. One moment she was breathing shallowly and with effort, and the next she simply was not breathing anymore. I sat there holding her hand long after it had gone cold, unable to move, unable to process what she had told me. My mother came back into the room with 2 cups of coffee and found me that way, staring at Nana Ruth's face, tears running down my cheeks, without me even realizing I had been crying. I did not tell her what I had heard. I did not tell anyone. Part of me wanted to believe it had only been the delirium of a dying woman, the confusion of a brain shutting down, memories tangled with dreams and regrets with no basis in reality. I clung to that hope through the funeral, through the burial in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church where Nana Ruth had prayed for 60 years, and through the weeks afterward when I tried to return to my normal life and pretend everything was fine. But I could not stop thinking about Donna Whitmore, about Terrence Gould, about a man named Lloyd Becker walking toward a house with something heavy in his hands on a summer night 30 years earlier. Nearly 3 weeks after the funeral, I finally broke down and searched online. I told myself I only wanted to prove that Nana Ruth had been confused, that no murder had happened on Chestnut Road in Westboro in 1987, that the whole story was a fiction built by her dying mind out of fragments of old television shows and half-remembered news. I typed Donna Whitmore, Westboro, 1987, and hit enter. The first result made me feel as if all the air had been ripped from the room. There she was, in a newspaper photograph from the Westboro Herald, grainy and faded but undeniably real. Red hair, a soft smile, a small silver cross visible at her throat. The headline read, "Local woman killed in home invasion," and the date was July 18th, 1987. I read article after article, my hands trembling over the keyboard, going through the investigation, the arrest, the trial, and the conviction. Terrence Gould's mugshot stared back at me from the screen. He was a thin man with sunken eyes and an expression of bewildered terror, as if he could not understand what was happening to him. Then I found something that completely took my breath away. A small article from barely 2 months earlier, tucked into the local news section of the Westboro paper. The headline read, "Cold Case Review. 1987 Whitmore murder reopened after new evidence emerges." I read that article so many times I could have recited it from memory. A detective named Hank Ellsworth had been assigned to review old cases as part of a statewide initiative. And when he reviewed the Whitmore file, he found inconsistencies that the original investigators had overlooked. The pawn ticket that had convicted Terrence Gould was dated July 19th, one day after the murder. But records from the owner of the pawn shop showed that the shop had not opened until noon that day. Additionally, several witnesses placed Terrence passed out drunk in his room above the feed store until well after 2 in the afternoon. There was no way he could have pawned that necklace within the time frame the prosecution had claimed. Even more disturbing, Detective Ellsworth had found notes in the original case file suggesting that another neighbor had mentioned seeing someone near the Whitmore house that night. A man who did not match Terrence Gould's description at all. That lead had never been investigated. The neighbor who made the statement had died in 1994, but her name was still there in the file, written in faded blue ink on a yellowing sheet of paper. Her name was Ruth Becker, my grandmother. She had told the police something after all, something that contradicted her later testimony, and someone had buried it. I spent the next week barely sleeping and barely eating, reading everything I could find about the case and the people involved. Gene Whitmore remarried in 1991 and moved to Florida, where he died of a heart attack in 2008. Lloyd Becker, my great-uncle, a man I had never met and whose name I had not even heard until Nana Ruth whispered it in that hospital room, left Westboro shortly after the trial and spent the rest of his life moving from town to town across the Midwest. He died alone in a motel room in Iowa in 2012. Liver failure. No family at the funeral. The only people still alive who might know the truth were Donna's 2 children, now adults with families of their own. And apparently they were the ones pushing for the case to be reopened. I found an interview with the daughter, a woman named Catherine, who had been 6 years old when her mother was killed. She said she had spent her whole life believing Terrence Gould was the monster who destroyed her family, but now she was not so sure. She said she remembered things from that night, fragments that did not fit. Images of her father talking to a man in the backyard while her mother was supposed to be in Pittsburgh. She had been too young to understand what she was seeing, but the memory had never left her. I called Detective Ellsworth on a Monday morning in November, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the hospital where I worked, because I could not force myself to make that call from my apartment. My voice shook when I told him who I was and what I knew. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he asked me to come to the station and give a formal statement. I drove to Westboro that same afternoon, 3 hours along the same route I had taken to watch my grandmother die. I sat in a small gray room lit by fluorescent lights and told a stranger everything Nana Ruth had told me. I showed him the notes I had written in the days after her death, every detail I could remember, every name, every description. He listened without interrupting, his face completely unreadable. And when I finished, he thanked me and said they would be in touch. I walked out of that police station feeling empty, as if I had left some essential part of myself in that room. I had just destroyed my grandmother's memory. I had exposed her as someone who let an innocent man rot in prison in order to protect a killer. But I also knew that Terrence Gould deserved to have his name cleared, even if he was no longer alive to see it. His family deserved to know. Donna's children deserved to know. The truth does not stop mattering just because the people who lived it are gone. The case is still under investigation as of now. Detective Ellsworth told me last month that they are working to officially exonerate Terrence Gould. Although these things take time, and the wheels of justice move slowly, especially when it involves a man who has been dead for more than 15 years. I never told my mother what Nana Ruth confessed to me, and I do not know if I ever will. Some truths are too heavy to share with the people who love the accused, and my mother revered her mother the same way I once did. Now I think about Nana Ruth every day, not the woman who made apple butter and taught me how to bake pies, but the woman who sat on her porch and watched a man walk toward a murder without doing anything to stop him. I think about how she lived with that secret for 30 years, how she went to church every Sunday and prayed to a God she believed was watching her, how she held that weight until it finally crushed her. I do not know if I can forgive her. I do not know if anyone can. But I know she wanted the truth to come to light, even though she had been too afraid to be the one to say it. In the end, that is why she told me. She knew I would not be able to stay silent. She knew I would do what she never could. And maybe that was her way of trying to make amends, passing the burden to someone strong enough to carry it into the light. I only wish she had done it 30 years earlier, before Terrence Gould died alone in a cell for a crime he did not commit, still waiting for someone to believe him. Story 5. Grandma Evelyn called me on a Wednesday night. She said she needed help going through some old boxes in the attic and asked if I could come stay for the weekend. Her voice sounded strange over the phone, shaky in a way I had never heard from her before. And in the background, Grandpa Howard kept interrupting, saying something I could not make out. They lived on a 40-acre property in rural West Virginia, almost entirely woods and old overgrown farmland, a place that had belonged to the family since before my mother was born. I had not visited them since Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, and guilt had been eating away at me for a while. So I said yes, requested Friday off from work, and made the 6-hour drive from Richmond. My friends thought it was sweet that I was going to help my elderly grandparents. They had no idea where I was really going. None of us did. If I had known, I would have stayed home and never answered that call. I would have let it ring until it went to voicemail and then deleted the message without listening to it. I arrived at their property around 4 in the afternoon that Friday, the first week of April, when everything was still brown and dead from winter. The driveway was almost a quarter-mile of gravel that had mostly turned into mud, and my car struggled to get through the deepest stretches. Grandma was waiting for me on the porch when I arrived, wrapped in a thick cardigan even though it was not that cold. She looked smaller than I remembered. Grandpa stayed inside watching some game show on the old television and barely greeted me when I came in with my overnight bag. There was a tension in the house that I noticed immediately. Brief glances between them when they thought I was not paying attention. Grandma would start to say something and then stop herself, changing the subject to something trivial, like the weather or what she was making for dinner. I thought maybe they were just getting older, perhaps dealing with health problems they did not want to worry me about. But it was more than that. Something was wrong in that house, something neither of them wanted to talk about. And I spent that entire first night trying to figure out what it was. On Saturday morning, I woke up early, around 6, because I heard the back door slam shut. I looked out the guest bedroom window and saw Grandpa walking toward the tree line at the edge of the property, carrying a plastic grocery bag in one hand. He was moving faster than I had seen him move in years, with purpose, as if he had somewhere specific to go. I thought maybe he was going to feed stray cats or check something in the old barn, so I did not think too much of it and went back to bed for another hour. When I came downstairs for breakfast, he was already back, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. Grandma made scrambled eggs and toast, and we talked about normal things, my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. But I noticed that the grocery bag was gone. And when I casually asked Grandpa what he had been doing outside so early, he simply said he was checking the property line for fallen branches. Grandma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth for just a second. Then she kept eating as if everything was fine. That was the first clear lie I caught them in, and it made me wonder what else they were hiding. After breakfast, Grandma asked if I wanted to take a walk around the property, get some fresh air before we started on the attic boxes. I said yes, thinking it would be nice to stretch my legs after the long drive. We walked past the old chicken coop, which had not held chickens in decades, past the half-collapsed barn with the rusted tractor inside, and toward the edge of the woods. Grandma pointed out different trees she remembered from her childhood. She told me stories about playing in those woods as a little girl. But I noticed she kept steering us away from a certain direction. She always found a reason to turn left instead of right, to circle around and head back toward the house. At one point, I saw what looked like a worn path cutting through the brush and leading deeper into the woods, and I asked where it went. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was just an old hunting trail that did not lead anywhere anymore. Her voice sounded tense when she said it, and she would not look me in the eye. That trail was clearly in use. The vegetation was flattened, and there were fresh boot prints in the mud. Someone had walked that way recently, and Grandma did not want me to know. That afternoon, while my grandparents were napping, I decided to follow the trail on my own. I told myself I was only curious. Maybe there was an old shed or something interesting back there. Nothing to worry about. I put on my hiking boots and stepped into the woods, following the marked path between the trees. The forest was dense, mostly oak and pine, and the farther I went, the quieter everything became. There were no birds singing, no squirrels racing through the branches, only my footsteps crunching over dead leaves. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing, and then I saw the well. It was an old stone well, the kind you see in photographs from 100 years ago, with a wooden lid placed over it. The lid looked newer than the well itself, maybe only a few years old, and it had heavy rocks on top of it, as if someone wanted to make sure it stayed closed. But what really caught my attention was the structure beside it, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked like an old root cellar or storm shelter, a concrete entrance built into the side of a small hill with a rusty metal door that was slightly ajar. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct told me to go back to the house and pretend I had never found that place. But I kept thinking about Grandpa slipping out at dawn with that grocery bag, about Grandma steering me away from that direction, about all the strange looks and half-finished sentences. So I walked over to the shelter and pulled the door open wider. The hinges squealed with rust and the smell hit me immediately. Damp earth and something else. Something stale. Something human. I used my phone flashlight to look inside, and my heart began pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. There were stairs leading down into the darkness, maybe 8 or 10 concrete steps, and at the bottom I could make out a small room. Someone had been living down there. There was a cot with blankets piled on top of it, empty water bottles scattered across the floor, cans of food stacked against the wall, and a bucket in one corner that I did not want to think about. And on the walls, written with what looked like marker or maybe charcoal, there were words, phrases, please. I forced myself to go down those steps, even though every part of me wanted to run. I began reading what had been written across the concrete walls. The handwriting was messy, desperate. Some parts had been scratched so hard into the concrete that whoever wrote them must have broken the marker or charcoal more than once. The first thing I read was near the door at eye level, and it said, "Please don't send me back. They'll kill me." No punctuation, no capital letters, just pure fear turned into words. Farther along the wall there was more. I did what they asked. I stayed quiet, and in larger letters near the cot, "How long do I have to stay here?" There were tally marks scratched into one section of the wall, grouped in 5s. I counted them twice to be sure. 117 days. Someone had been down there for almost 4 months, marking every day, waiting for something. The most recent writing was near the stairs, and it was different from the rest. Somehow calmer, more resigned. It only said, "They are good people. They are trying to help me. I know that now." That sentence unsettled me more than all the desperate pleas combined. It sounded like something a person would write after giving up, after accepting whatever was happening to them. I took pictures of everything with my phone, my hands shaking so badly that half of them came out blurry. I searched the rest of the shelter, looking for anything that might tell me who had been kept down there. Under the cot, I found a small pile of clothes, a worn flannel shirt and jeans that seemed to belong to a man, maybe medium build. There was a paperback book with no cover, some kind of thriller as far as I could tell, with several pages folded at the corners. In the corner behind the cans of food, I found a wallet. It was old. The leather was cracked and faded. Inside, there was no money and no credit cards, only a West Virginia driver's license. The photo showed a man in his mid-30s, thin face, dark hair, tired eyes. The name on the license was Curtis Allen Webb, and according to the birth date, he had been 34 when it was issued. The issue date was 2015, which meant it had expired years ago. I stared at that face for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. Who was this man? Why had my grandparents kept him in an underground shelter on their property? And where was he now? The cot did not look like it had been used recently. The blankets were cold and a layer of dust covered everything. Whoever Curtis Webb was, he had not been down there in a long time, but someone was still maintaining that place. Someone was still coming out there. The grocery bag Grandpa had carried that morning had to be connected somehow. I put the wallet in my pocket and climbed back up the stairs, my legs shaking so badly that I had to grab the railing to keep from falling. When I came out, I looked at the well again. This time I really looked at it. The wooden lid was thick, solid, built to hold weight. The rocks on top of it were not there for decoration. They were there to keep something in or to keep someone out. I walked over and tried to move one of the rocks, but it was heavier than it looked, maybe 40 or 50 pounds. I managed to slide it aside, then another, until I could lift the edge of the wooden lid just enough to peek inside. The smell that rose from within was horrible, damp and rotten, like stagnant water mixed with decay. I shone my phone flashlight down, but the well was deep, maybe around 30 feet, and I could not see the bottom clearly. There was water down there, black and still, and something was floating on the surface. It looked like fabric, maybe clothing, bunched up and soaked. I could not tell what it was, and I did not want to know. I let the lid fall back down, pushed the rocks back into place, and returned to the house as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. My grandparents were awake when I got back, sitting in the living room, watching television as if nothing in the world was wrong. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at these two people I had known my whole life, trying to reconcile the grandparents who had taught me to fish and baked me birthday cakes with whatever was happening in that underground shelter. Grandma looked up and smiled at me. She asked if I had enjoyed my walk. I told her yes, that it had been nice. Then I went upstairs to the guest bedroom and locked the door. I sat on the bed, took out the wallet, and stared at Curtis Webb's face on that expired license. I searched his name on my phone, but the signal there was terrible. Barely one bar, and nothing loaded. I tried different combinations. Curtis Webb, West Virginia. Curtis Webb missing. Curtis Webb obituary. The pages just kept spinning, never opening, until I finally gave up. I needed to confront my grandparents, but I had no idea how to even begin that conversation. "Hey, Grandma, I found your underground bunker and the ID of the man you were keeping prisoner. Care to explain?" It sounded absurd even inside my own head, but I could not pretend I had not seen what I had seen. That shelter, those desperate words on the walls, the thing floating in the well. Something terrible had happened on that property, and my grandparents were at the center of it. I waited until dinner. I sat across from them at the kitchen table while Grandma served meatloaf and mashed potatoes as if it were any normal Saturday night. I could barely eat. I just moved the food around my plate, trying to find the right words. Finally, when Grandpa got up to refill his glass of water, I took out the wallet and placed it on the table. Grandma saw it first, and the color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands to steady herself and whispered something I could not hear. Grandpa turned around, saw the wallet, and his entire body went rigid. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Grandma looked at me with eyes I had never seen from her before, tired, frightened, and somehow relieved all at once. And she said they had been wondering when someone would find out. She said they had been carrying it for years, that it was eating them alive, and that maybe it was time to tell someone the truth. Grandpa sat back down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. He told me to put the wallet away because he could not bear to look at that face again. They told me that Curtis Webb had appeared at their door in the fall of 2015, desperate, bleeding from a wound on his forehead, begging them to hide him. He said there were people after him, bad people, that he had seen something he was not supposed to see, and now they wanted to kill him. My grandparents did not know what to do. They were isolated out there with no close neighbors, and that terrified man was pleading for his life on their porch. So they let him stay in the old storm shelter for just a few days until things calmed down. That was what they told themselves. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Curtis was paranoid. He would not let them call the police. He said the people looking for him had contacts everywhere. Grandma brought him food and water every day. Grandpa reinforced the shelter door, and both of them kept his secret. They told me he was a good man, just scared, that he never hurt anyone and never asked for too much. He wrote on the walls to stay sane, counting the days until it was safe to leave. But it was never safe, or at least that was what Curtis believed, and over time something inside him broke. Grandma stopped talking at that point. She could not continue. Grandpa had to finish the story with tears running down his face. He told me that one morning in early 2016, after Curtis had been in the shelter for about 4 months, Grandma went to bring him breakfast and found the door wide open. Curtis was gone. His clothes were still there, the blankets too. Everything was still there except the man. They searched the property for days. They called his name, checked every building and every corner of those 40 acres. Nothing. He had simply disappeared in the middle of the night without taking anything. Grandpa said they assumed he had finally felt safe enough to leave, that he had escaped to start over somewhere else. Then I asked about the well. The question came out of my mouth before I could stop it, and both of them went silent. Grandma started crying. Silent sobs shook her entire body. Grandpa only stared at the table as if he were seeing through it towards something terrible. He said they found the well lid moved a few weeks after Curtis disappeared. He said they looked inside and saw something floating in the water, but they were not able to climb down and check. They convinced themselves it was only old clothes, debris, anything other than what they feared it might be. They put the lid back, secured it with rocks, and never spoke of it again. Not to each other, not to anyone, for almost 10 years. I left the next morning. I barely said goodbye. I drove the 6 hours back to Richmond with my head spinning. I never called the police. I know I should have, but they were my grandparents. 2 people in their 80s who had already lost their daughter and who were clearly haunted by whatever had happened to Curtis Webb. What would reporting it accomplish then? If Curtis was in that well, he had been dead for almost a decade. And my grandparents, they truly believed they were helping someone, hiding a frightened man from people who wanted to hurt him. Were they wrong to do it? Probably. Did something go terribly wrong? Almost certainly. But I could not be the one to send them to prison in the final years of their lives. Grandpa died 8 months later, a heart attack in his sleep. Grandma followed him 6 weeks after that, as if she had simply given up once he was gone. I inherited the property, all 40 acres, and I have not set foot there since. The house is still standing. The shelter is still out there in the woods, and that well is still covered with those heavy rocks. Sometimes I think about Curtis Webb. I wonder who he really was, what he saw that left him so terrified, whether anyone ever looked for him. I think about what might still be floating in that black water, waiting to be found. But I am never going back there to check. Some answers are not worth it, and some secrets should remain buried exactly where they are. Story 6. My grandmother waited until she was 83 years old to finally tell me the truth. I had driven to Tucson to visit my grandparents, something I try to do every few months now that my grandfather's dementia has gotten worse. 15 years producing television commercials in Los Angeles had taught me plenty about the way this industry destroys people. And most of my film school classmates from the class of 2007 had already scattered into other professions. But nothing I had lived through prepared me for what she told me that afternoon, sitting in her kitchen while my grandfather slept in the next room. She gripped my wrist with unexpected strength and told me she needed to tell me something before it was too late. Something about the real reason they left the business in 1974, right when both of them were on the verge of real success. I had always wondered why two genuinely talented people, my grandmother as a session singer and my grandfather as a highly sought-after studio musician, simply vanished from an industry they loved. The family version had always been vague. Something about wanting a quieter life, about raising my mother away from the chaos of Los Angeles. But sitting there, watching her face in the afternoon light, I could see she was about to undo 50 years of carefully constructed silence. She began by asking me if I remembered the name Clive Ashford. I told her no, and she nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. Clive Ashford, she explained, was a talent manager who worked out of a beautiful office on Wilshire Boulevard in the early 1970s. He represented legitimate artists, some of them famous names I would recognize, and that legitimacy was exactly what made him so dangerous. My grandmother met him through a mutual friend during a recording session in October 1974. She was 26 years old, had been married to my grandfather for 3 years, and was hungry for that big break that always seemed just out of reach. Clive told her he had contacts at a major record label that was looking for new voices for a different kind of project, something experimental that could launch careers overnight. He was charming, dressed impeccably, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had already opened doors for dozens of artists. My grandmother said she felt lucky, even chosen, especially when he invited her to a private audition at a studio in the Valley the following Saturday. My grandfather had a conflicting commitment that day, a wedding reception in San Diego, so she would have to go alone. That detail, she said, was not a coincidence. She understands that now. Clive had been watching them for weeks, learning their schedules, waiting for the right moment. The address Clive gave her led to an industrial area in Van Nuys, far from the polished studios she was used to. My grandmother told me she almost turned around when she saw the building. A low concrete structure with no signs, surrounded by a chain-link fence and empty lots full of dry weeds. But there were other cars in the parking lot. Good cars, a Cadillac and a Lincoln Continental. And she convinced herself that serious music people sometimes worked in unglamorous spaces. She parked her Volkswagen Beetle and walked toward the entrance, where a young man in a suit was waiting with a clipboard. He checked her name, smiled politely, and led her inside. On the inside, the place was surprisingly well appointed, with wood paneling, thick carpet, and framed gold records on the walls. She remembered feeling relieved, thinking she had misjudged the building from the outside. The young man led her to a lounge where 2 other women were already waiting, both around her age, both clearly singers or actresses based on their careful makeup and the nervous energy they shared. They exchanged polite introductions, first names only, and waited together on leather couches while soft jazz played from hidden speakers. After about 20 minutes, Clive appeared through a side door, wearing a burgundy blazer and rings on 3 fingers that caught the light every time he gestured. He greeted them warmly, calling each woman by name without checking any notes, complimenting specific details of their previous work, making it clear he had researched them. My grandmother said he had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, as if he truly believed in your talent and wanted nothing more than to see you succeed. He explained that the audition would be a little unconventional. He said the record label executives preferred to see how artists handled unexpected situations, how they reacted under pressure. He asked them to follow him down a hallway toward the main studio. My grandmother remembers walking behind the other two women, noticing how thick the walls seemed, how the jazz music faded completely as they moved deeper into the building. When they reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway, Clive took a key from his pocket and unlocked it with a theatrical gesture. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, indicating that they should enter. My grandmother was the last to cross the threshold, and she heard the click of the lock closing behind her before she fully registered what she was seeing. The room was not a recording studio. It was a warehouse. Bare concrete floors, exposed pipes along the ceiling, and industrial lights that buzzed and flickered. In the center was a long table covered with objects that made no sense in that context. Jewelry, watches, stacks of documents, a typewriter, several cameras, and what looked like bundles of cash held together with rubber bands. 3 men were sitting in folding chairs against the far wall. None of them looked like music executives. They wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and watched the women enter with expressions my grandmother described as hungry, as if they had been waiting for that moment for a long time. Clive walked past the women to the table, still smiling, still projecting that relaxed confidence. He picked up a manila folder and opened it, reading aloud what seemed like a script. He said they had been selected for a special opportunity, a chance to earn in one afternoon more money than most session singers made in a year. All they had to do was follow instructions. One of the other women, a blonde with a southern accent, asked what kind of instructions. Clive set the folder on the table and explained in the same pleasant tone he might have used to discuss recording schedules that they would drive to a location in Beverly Hills and retrieve certain items from a residence while the owners were away. My grandmother said the reality of the situation struck her like a physical blow. This was not an audition. It was recruitment, and they were being asked to commit a robbery. The other 2 women reacted differently than she expected. The blonde went pale and began crying silently, but the third woman, a brunette who had introduced herself as Francine, seemed almost unsurprised, as if she had suspected from the beginning that something was wrong but had chosen to come anyway. Clive kept talking. He explained that the homeowners were out of the country, that the security system had already been disabled by an inside contact, that the entire job would take less than an hour. He emphasized that no one would get hurt, that the items were insured, that the victims were wealthy people who would barely notice the loss. He made it sound reasonable, almost victimless. Then he mentioned the compensation, $10,000 for each of them, in cash, paid immediately once the job was complete. My grandmother told me that even while she was afraid, even knowing that this was deeply wrong, a part of her brain did the math. $10,000 in 1974 was more than she and my grandfather made together in 6 months. She hated herself for even considering it, but that hesitation, those few seconds of temptation, gave her enough time to notice something important in the room. There was a second door. It was partially hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets in the corner, painted the same gray as the walls, but she could make out the outline of the frame and the glint of a handle. She did not look directly at it. She did not want to draw attention, but she memorized its location while Clive continued talking. Now he was explaining the logistics, how they would travel in separate vehicles, how they would enter through a service entrance at the back of the property, how each woman would be responsible for certain items on a list. One of the men against the wall stood up and walked toward them with 3 pairs of thin leather gloves. My grandmother accepted hers without making eye contact, feeling the soft material between her fingers, understanding that all of this was real, that these people had done this before, that they had a system. The blonde woman was now crying openly, saying she wanted to go home, that she had a daughter waiting for her. Clive's demeanor changed for the first time. His smile remained, but something cold entered his voice when he told her that leaving was not an option, that they knew where she lived, where her daughter went to school, and that cooperating was the only way forward. The room went silent except for the buzzing of the lights overhead. My grandmother felt her heart pounding so hard she feared the men could see it through her blouse. Then Francine spoke, asking practical questions about timing, the target address, and what kind of vehicle they would use. My grandmother understood with nauseating clarity that Francine was going to do it, that she had already made her decision, maybe even before entering that building. Clive seemed pleased with her cooperation and focused his attention on answering her in detail. While he was distracted, my grandmother took one small step backward, then another. She positioned herself closer to the hidden door. She was not thinking clearly. She was acting on pure survival instinct. Her body was making decisions her conscious mind had not yet approved. Suddenly, the blonde woman collapsed to the floor, hyperventilating, and the two men who were still seated rushed forward to help restrain her. In that instant of chaos, with everyone's attention on the crying woman, my grandmother moved. She crossed the distance to the pallets in 4 quick steps, found the handle, and pulled. The door was not locked. She slipped into the darkness and ran without looking back, her heels clattering against the concrete, her lungs burning, her mind completely blank except for one thought repeating again and again. Get out. Get out. Get out. The door led to a narrow corridor that smelled like motor oil and rust. Emergency exit signs glowed red at intervals along the ceiling, and she followed them blindly, tripping twice over debris she could not see, tearing her stockings on something sharp. She could already hear shouting behind her, male voices bouncing off the walls. But she did not slow down. The hallway ended at a metal emergency door with a push bar, and she slammed into it at full speed, bursting out into the blinding afternoon light. She found herself in an alley behind the building, overflowing dumpsters, a stray dog watching her from beside a pile of cardboard boxes. Her Volkswagen was parked on the other side of the building, impossible to reach without being seen. So she made a split-second decision and ran the opposite way toward the street. She kicked off her heels and ran barefoot over the hot asphalt, not caring about the pain, not caring about anything except putting distance between herself and that gray concrete room. She reached a busy intersection and flagged down the first car she saw, a station wagon driven by an older woman who looked terrified by the barefoot, wild-eyed stranger pounding on her window. My grandmother begged her to drive. She told her she was being chased, that her life was in danger. The woman hesitated for only a second before unlocking the door. They drove in silence for several miles before my grandmother felt safe enough to speak. The woman, whose name she never learned, dropped her off at a gas station in Burbank, where she called my grandfather from a payphone. She was crying so hard she could barely form words, and he left the wedding reception immediately, driving 90 miles per hour on the freeway to reach her. When he arrived, she told him everything, every detail, sitting in the front seat of his car in the parking lot of that gas station as the sun set. My grandfather wanted to go to the police, but my grandmother refused. Clive knew her name, knew where she worked, and probably knew where they lived. These were not amateurs running a minor scam. It was something organized, methodical, and clearly not the first time they had done it. She had seen the objects on the table, dozens of stolen goods ready to be distributed, and she had seen the look in those men's eyes when the blonde tried to refuse. Going to the police would mean giving statements, testifying, putting their names into official records that could be accessed by people with connections. She was convinced that cooperating with the authorities would get them both killed. My grandfather argued with her for hours, but in the end, her fear won. That same night, they went home and began packing. In less than 2 weeks, they had sold everything that would not fit in their car and drove to Tucson, where one of my grandfather's cousins agreed to let them stay until they could get settled. They told everyone they were leaving for personal reasons, family obligations, a sick relative who needed care. They canceled recording sessions, broke contracts, burned bridges with producers and record labels who had invested time and money in their careers. My grandmother said the hardest part was not the financial loss or the destruction of their professional lives, but the silence that came afterward. For years, she waited for a knock at the door, a threatening phone call, some sign that Clive and his people had found them. It never came. She does not know what happened to the blonde woman or to Francine. She never saw news about a robbery ring being dismantled. She never heard Clive Ashford's name connected to any criminal investigation. It was as if that afternoon in Van Nuys had been erased from history, existing only in her memory, like a wound that never fully closed. She and my grandfather rebuilt their lives in Tucson, found ordinary jobs, and raised my mother in quiet anonymity. They never spoke about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. My grandfather carried the secret with him into dementia, and my grandmother carried it alone for 50 years, until that afternoon in her kitchen, when she finally decided I was old enough and successful enough in the same industry that had nearly destroyed her to know the truth. I drove back to Los Angeles the next day with my head spinning. I spent weeks searching for any trace of Clive Ashford, going through old newspaper archives, industry records, and public databases. I found nothing definitive, only a few mentions of a talent manager by that name who had worked in the early 1970s and then apparently disappeared around 1975. No criminal charges, no obituary, no forwarding address. I thought about hiring a private investigator, about digging deeper, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the expression on my grandmother's face when she finished her story. That relief mixed with residual terror that had lived inside her for half a century. Maybe it was realizing that some answers are not worth finding. My grandparents sacrificed everything to disappear, to protect themselves and the family they would one day have from people who moved in the shadows. Reopening that door felt like a betrayal of everything they had endured. So I let it go. Now I visit them more often. And sometimes when I sit with my grandmother while my grandfather sleeps, she mentions small details she forgot to include, fragments of that day that suddenly resurface. Recently, she told me she still remembers the song playing in the lounge when she arrived, a song by the Carpenters, something soft and hopeful that she can no longer hear without feeling sick. She told me she sometimes dreams about Francine. She wonders if Francine went through with the job. She wonders if she is still alive somewhere, living with her own version of that secret. I have no answers for her. All I can do is listen and make sure she knows that her story, their story, will not die when she does. Some truths deserve to be remembered, even the ones that were never recorded in any official file. Story 7. In late summer of 2024, I ended up staying a few nights at my grandmother Edith's house to help my mother manage the situation from a distance. My life had slowed down by then. Freelance work, no strict schedule, and plenty of quiet hours that made the request seem manageable. Edith lived alone in a modest suburban house, the kind with narrow hallways and doors that never quite fit right. Her dementia had been getting worse, especially after sunset. But during the day, she could still hold a conversation and joke about old television shows. I told myself this was just a family obligation, nothing dramatic. The first night passed with mild confusion, repeated questions, and a nervous habit of checking the windows. Even so, she recognized me, called me by my name, and insisted on making tea that she then forgot to drink. I slept in the guest room with my shoes beside the bed in case she started wandering. At that point, fear was still not part of the equation. When the daylight began to fade the next evening, her behavior changed in a way I had not seen before. Edith stopped pacing and instead sat very still at the kitchen table, her eyes alert, listening to every sound in the house. When she spoke, her voice dropped in tone. She accused me of touching her things, moving papers, opening drawers. She asked why I kept checking my phone so much and who I was reporting to. When I tried to laugh it off, she slammed her hand on the table so hard the silverware rattled. The warmth she had shown earlier disappeared, replaced by something suspicious and defiant. She followed me from room to room, keeping a careful distance, watching my hands. Every light switch I touched triggered a comment. By the time I retreated to the bedroom, my chest felt tight with an unease I could not explain. That night unfolded slowly, stretched thin by the silence of the house. The guest room door closed with a soft click that did not seem to come from my side. A moment later, I heard metal scraping against metal, deliberate and controlled. Edith's voice came through the door, calm and firm, explaining that she needed to lock it from the outside. She said she could not risk letting it move freely once the house settled. I asked her what she meant, keeping my voice low so I would not make the situation worse. She told me I knew exactly what she meant and accused me of pretending. Her footsteps moved away, followed by the sound of another lock turning somewhere in the hallway. Sleep never came. I sat on the bed listening to the house breathe, counting every creak. Morning light filtered into the room through the blinds, ordinary and cruel in how normal it felt. The door opened easily when I tried it, although the frame had fresh scratches around the strike plate. The metal looked bent, forced as if someone had fought with it from the outside. Edith was in the kitchen humming cheerful, asking why I looked so tired. She remembered nothing from the night before, nothing about the locks, nothing about any of it. When I showed her the damage, she frowned as if she had never seen that door before. The house felt empty in a way I cannot fully explain, as if something had slipped away quietly before dawn. I packed my bag before lunch, promising I would come back soon, knowing I would not sleep another night under that roof. Driving away did not bring the relief I expected. The image of those scratches stayed vivid, replaying in my mind every time traffic stopped. By afternoon, guilt began to settle in, heavy and insistent. So I went back that same day with bags of groceries and the determination to stay one more night. Edith greeted me warmly, apologizing for being difficult lately, though she could not explain what that meant. I checked the doors again when she was not looking. The damaged locks were still there, deeper than I remembered, like grooves carved with intention. I told myself stress had sharpened my imagination. As the sun dropped, shadows stretched down the hallway, and Edith stopped smiling in the middle of a sentence. She narrowed her eyes as if she had heard a voice I could not hear. Dinner sat untouched. She asked me to sit where she could see me. Once darkness settled in, Edith's vigilance returned stronger than before. She whispered instead of speaking, warning me not to move too quickly, not to test her patience. Every few minutes she checked the hallway, pressing her ear against the wall and nodding as if she were listening to instructions. When I suggested calling my mother, her face hardened and she accused me of sending signals. She blocked the kitchen entrance with a chair, explaining that paths mattered at night. The house felt smaller with every adjustment she made. Furniture dragged into strange positions, lamps unplugged. When I finally excused myself to go to the bedroom, she followed, staying far enough back that I could not read her expression clearly. The door closed between us, and I waited for the sound I feared. This time the locks came fast, firm clicks followed by the unmistakable scrape of force being applied. Edith spoke through the door again, serene and patient, saying that tonight was worse, that it was learning. She said she could hear it breathing near the vents and that it copied footsteps when it moved. I asked her to open the door, trying to reason with her, but she only replied that loving someone sometimes meant containing them. Something brushed against the other side of the door, slow and deliberate. It was not heavy, but it was intentional enough to quicken my pulse. The ceiling vent rattled once and then went silent. I sat on the floor until my legs went numb, listening to her whisper instructions to someone who was not there. Morning came gray and dull. Edith was asleep in her chair, her hands folded at peace. She laughed when I asked her about the night before, insisting she had gone to bed early. The scratches on the lock were worse, curving outward like metal torn by fingernails. I took photos, called my mother, and arranged home care that same day. When the caregiver arrived, Edith stayed very close to me, holding onto my sleeve, and asked quietly if I had told them about it. I did not answer. Leaving that house felt final this time, not rushed, only necessary. Whatever she believed she was protecting us from, I could not stay long enough to find out. I did not go back after that day, but the house did not leave my thoughts. Over the following week, the caregiver called twice with questions that tightened my chest. She mentioned that Edith insisted certain doors remain sealed after sundown and refused to sleep unless chairs were wedged under the doorknobs. One night, the caregiver found Edith standing in the hallway, her palm pressed against a bedroom door, listening. When she asked what she was doing, Edith said she was checking whether it had learned patience yet. The caregiver laughed at first, thinking it was part of the illness. Then she noticed that the air vents had been covered with towels, stuffed tightly inside as if someone were trying to block the airflow. No one could explain how Edith had had the strength to do it alone. A week later, a locksmith was called to replace the damaged hardware. He called me directly, his voice uneasy, asking what kind of force could cause that kind of wear from the outside. He said the grooves did not match tools, but rather repeated pressure from something irregular. While he worked, Edith sat at the kitchen table, calm and polite, offering him candies she kept in her pocket. She told him not to worry, that it would not try anything during the day. When he asked what she meant, she only smiled and said daylight made the rules simpler. He finished faster than expected and refused to stay after dark. That was the first time someone else reacted the way I had. The final incident happened less than a month later. The caregiver arrived one morning and found Edith locked inside her bedroom. The door had been sealed from the outside, with furniture dragged over to block it. Edith answered from the other side, irritated by the interruption, explaining that she had done it herself to keep things contained. She was not hurt. Once the door was open, she was lucid and confused by everyone's concern. After that, adult services intervened, and she was moved to a facility where nights were supervised and doors could not be manually locked. The house was sold shortly afterward, emptied quickly without questions. I never asked the new owners how the nights felt there. Some things do not need confirmation. I still think about the way she spoke, about how calm she was when she said she could not let it wander freely. Dementia explains many things, but it does not explain the damage or the way several people felt something watching them after dark in that house. Maybe she believed she was protecting us from something imaginary, or maybe fear gave her strength and purpose when her mind was beginning to fail. What I know is this. After she moved out, no more scratches appeared on the locks, no doors sealed themselves again, and no one reported sounds in the vents. Whatever she believed she was keeping under control, it stopped the moment she left. And that is the part I no longer try to rationalize. Story 8. People in this community usually understand why someone might take years to put a story into writing. And this is one of those cases too. I am writing about something that happened during the final stretch of my childhood, in a quiet town where routines carried more weight than questions. Back then, my days were divided between school, a part-time job at a hardware store, and wandering the neighborhood with my friends until the streetlights buzzed on. Life felt small but stable, the kind of rhythm you believe will never break. One of the people who was part of that rhythm was a girl named Kara, whom I had known since elementary school. We lived 3 blocks apart, shared the same bus stop, and had the kind of friendship that does not require constant conversation. Her house always smelled faintly of boiled vegetables and old paper, a detail that stayed with me even then. None of us imagined how abruptly that familiar presence could disappear. Kara lived with her grandmother, a woman everyone called Mrs. Wilkes, who already seemed ancient back then. She moved slowly, spoke carefully, and kept the curtains tightly closed no matter the time of day. During one summer, her behavior began to change in a way adults discussed in whispers but never explained to us. She began repeating herself in the middle of sentences, getting irritated over tiny things like shoes left by the door, or insisting that the windows stay sealed even in the heat. Kara stopped staying out late and began leaving our gatherings early, always mentioning rules she could not break. When I visited her, I noticed notes taped to the refrigerator with exact meal times and portions written in trembling ink. The house felt tense, as if it were holding its breath. Even so, no one called it dangerous, only sad or confusing. As the months passed, Kara changed too, though in subtler ways that could be missed if you were not close. She began flinching when strangers passed us on the sidewalk, and she pulled her sleeves down to cover her hands. She talked about food as if it were something risky, refusing anything that had not been prepared in a certain way. Sometimes she would stop in the middle of a conversation, listening to sounds no one else reacted to. When I asked what she heard, she would shrug and change the subject. Her grandmother stopped opening the door entirely, and the mailbox filled until the metal flap could barely close. Neighbors said they had seen grocery deliveries left on the porch all night. The house became a place people glanced at sideways but avoided. Then, without warning or explanation, Kara disappeared. One day, her seat on the bus was empty, and the following week the school office said she had been withdrawn. Mrs. Wilkes's house went dark. The notes disappeared from the windows, and a padlock appeared on the outside of the gate. The adults gave rehearsed answers about family matters and told us to stop speculating. Years later, after I had left town and built a life somewhere else, curiosity dragged me back to that story. Public records showed that both Kara and her grandmother had been living in near total isolation for a long time, following rigid schedules and strict rules driven by fear. Doctors later suggested it was an untreated psychological illness, especially in the grandmother's case. What still unsettles me is how closely Kara's collapse mirrored the routine she had been taught, and how little anyone intervened before it was too late. After that brief glimpse into the records, I could not shake the feeling that something had been quietly buried. I began contacting people who had known the family at the time, framing it as nostalgia more than concern. An old neighbor remembered the exact day everything finally fell apart, describing it as unusually quiet, even for that street. According to her, Mrs. Wilkes had stopped allowing any noise inside the house, including the radio or television. Kara had been withdrawn from school weeks earlier and was rarely seen outside. That day, apparently, a delivery driver waited on the porch for almost an hour, knocking first softly and then harder before leaving and leaving the bags untouched. No one saw movement behind the curtains. The silence disturbed people more than a scream ever would have. I managed to locate a retired social worker who had briefly reviewed the case years after the disappearance. She spoke cautiously, choosing her words as if she were still being recorded. She explained that the grandmother had developed severe paranoia centered on contamination and outside influence. Her routines were not simple habits, but protective rituals imposed with absolute authority. Kara's role shifted over time, from child to participant, and then to enforcer of the behaviors that were supposedly keeping them safe. The records indicated that Kara resisted at first, sneaking out to eat or staying near the windows. Over time, those acts stopped. The social worker said that kind of psychological entanglement was rare but devastating, especially without intervention. What disturbed me most was learning how that final day unfolded. Emergency services were called by a neighbor after a smell caused concern. Something sour and unmistakably wrong. Inside, they found Mrs. Wilkes unconscious, her body already cold. Kara was still alive, sitting at the kitchen table, following the schedule taped to the wall. She had not eaten since the night before because the next mealtime had not yet arrived. She did not cry or speak when help arrived. She only asked if they would seal the house again afterward. First responders noted that her calm was unsettling, like someone waiting for permission to exist. Kara was removed from the house that day and placed in long-term care, though details about where she was taken were limited. Her grandmother's death was ruled natural, but the circumstances raised concerns that never resulted in charges. The house was sold, cleaned, and repainted, erasing the visible traces of what had happened inside. Still, whenever I think about that single day, it feels like the quiet end of a long, invisible disaster. A girl learned that fear was routine, that obedience was safety, and that isolation was love. Even now, I wonder how different everything might have been if someone had knocked harder, asked more questions, or refused to look away. What followed was a kind of silent aftermath that did not appear in headlines or cause neighborhood meetings. Kara became a subject people alluded to vaguely, as if the details might bring something unpleasant back into the room. I learned that she was evaluated extensively and diagnosed with severe anxiety shaped by prolonged psychological control. Professionals believed she could improve, but only with long-term care and strict boundaries that separated her from the patterns she had learned. Her grandmother's influence was described as omnipresent, not malicious in a simple sense, but all-consuming. Fear had structured every hour inside that house. When authorities removed Kara, they also removed the framework she understood as survival. Recovery, I was told, meant rebuilding her sense of time, choice, and trust from nothing. I once drove past the old house after learning all of this, mostly out of a need to see it with my own eyes. The curtains were open now, and someone had planted flowers along the fence. From the outside, it looked ordinary, almost welcoming. Standing there, I tried to reconcile that image with the lists on the refrigerator, the locked gate, the silence stretching day after day. I was struck by how easily suffering can blend into a neighborhood without setting off alarms. No one thought to question the rules inside that house because they were labeled personal, private, and therefore untouchable. That realization stayed with me longer than the story itself. Sometimes I think about Kara sitting at that kitchen table, following instructions that no longer protected anyone. The image is not dramatic, just deeply sad. A girl trained to obey fear until it replaced her instinct. The medical explanations help, but they do not erase the feeling that something human failed long before professionals were called. The systems designed to detect patterns did not detect hers. Friends like me did not recognize the warning signs for what they were. We accepted strangeness as personality, control as care, and silence as normal. Those small concessions accumulated into years of isolation. Sharing this now is not about reopening wounds or assigning blame. It is about recognizing how quietly harm can spread when routines harden into law and love becomes conditional. Kara survived, and that matters. Even if her life took a path none of us imagined. The house moved on. The town moved on. And most people forgot. I did not. And I probably never will. Some stories do not end with answers, but with the certainty that paying attention when it comes too late can change everything. That is the part I carry with me, and the reason I finally wrote this. Story 9. Visiting my grandparents had always meant quiet afternoons and predictable routines, but this trip felt different from the moment I passed through the stone gates of the retirement community where they lived. They had moved there less than a year earlier, drawn in by glossy brochures that promised longevity, comfort, and a higher level of wellness. The place looked more like a luxury resort than a senior living complex. Glass facades, perfectly trimmed hedges, and employees dressed in spotless white uniforms. Everyone I saw walking along the paths looked unsettlingly healthy, with straight posture, bright eyes, and skin that did not seem to match their age. At first it was impressive, almost reassuring, like proof that my grandparents were in good hands. Still, there was something about the silence that bothered me. The way conversation stopped when staff members passed nearby. My grandfather, Harold, hugged me tightly, but he did not linger in the embrace for long. He glanced toward the main building as if he were being timed. My grandmother, June, smiled a lot, but her smile felt rehearsed, like a habit she could no longer turn off. That first night, I blamed it on adjusting to a new environment and told myself I was overthinking. Staying in their guest suite came with a stack of printed rules left neatly on the table, far more extensive than one would expect for a simple visit. Visiting hours were strict, meals were mandatory at assigned times, and certain hallways were clearly marked as off-limits. One rule stood out from the rest. It said guests were not allowed to interfere with any medical or wellness-related activity. I asked June about it casually, trying to sound curious rather than concerned. She immediately steered the conversation away, talking instead about how good the food was and how much better she slept now. Harold barely spoke. He only nodded but kept his eyes fixed on his plate. Later that night, I noticed security cameras in the hallways, far more than seemed reasonable for a place like that. Even the elevators required access cards, and residents were escorted during certain hours. It did not feel like protection. It felt like surveillance. The next morning, I accompanied my grandparents to what they called a wellness session, expecting something like physical therapy or yoga. Instead, they were separated in front of double doors marked with a clinical code instead of a name. Guests could not enter, so I waited nearby, pretending to check my phone while listening. From behind the doors came low mechanical humming, steady and constant, mixed with voices giving instructions in calm tones. Residents went in relaxed and talkative, but when they came out, their expressions were empty, their movements precise, almost synchronized. A woman walked past me with strangely dilated pupils and a fixed smile, as if she had forgotten why she was smiling. A staff member noticed me watching and gently positioned himself between the door and me without saying a word. The message was clear enough without language. When my grandparents returned, they insisted everything was fine, but neither of them could explain what the procedure actually involved. As the day went on, small details began to accumulate in a way I could no longer ignore. I heard 2 residents whispering near the garden, one asking the other how many cycles he had left. In the common room, a television repeated promotional videos about vitality and life extension, always cutting away before explaining how it was achieved. I saw locked doors marked as medical storage, each one fitted with biometric scanners instead of simple locks. During lunch, June repeated the same story twice, word for word, without realizing she had already told it. Harold's hands rested perfectly still on the table, not even trembling when he lifted his glass. When I asked about the friends they had made there, they had trouble naming anyone who had moved away or died. That was when I realized no one seemed to leave that place. Not really. That afternoon, curiosity overcame politeness, and I took a longer walk alone around the community while my grandparents rested. Behind the main recreational wing, a service corridor branched off toward a low building with frosted windows and no signs. A faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air, strong enough to irritate my nose. 2 residents in identical robes waited on a nearby bench. They had thin red marks around their wrists, as if very tight bands had recently been removed. One of them noticed me looking and warned me in a low voice not to ask questions if I planned to enjoy my stay. Before I could answer, an employee appeared and guided them inside, closing the door behind them with a keypad. The hallway lights dimmed slightly after they entered, as if conserving energy or hiding activity. Standing there alone, the place no longer seemed luxurious. It seemed controlled and carefully sealed. Dinner that night was quieter than the one before, and the dining room vibrated with an artificial cheerfulness that felt forced. Conversations revolved around improvements, clearer thinking, stronger joints, better memory. All of it said with the same calm cadence. Harold mentioned a new treatment he had been approved for, something that required a small contribution, though he could not explain what that meant. June gently squeezed his arm when he spoke, her eyes flicking toward a nearby staff member before returning to her plate. Later, back in the suite, I pushed them harder than I had before. I asked what they had signed when they moved in. They admitted there had been contracts, dense documents that outlined long-term care agreements and consent for experimental wellness programs. The word experimental hung between us, heavy and unresolved. Neither of them could say exactly what they had agreed to in exchange for staying there. Night fell, and sleep did not come easily, so I lay listening to the building around me. Somewhere below, machinery ran in steady intervals, not loud enough to identify, but persistent enough to notice. Footsteps echoed in the hallway at regular hours, followed by soft knocks and doors opening without conversation. From my window, I could see a small group of residents being escorted across the courtyard, their robes tied neatly and their faces expressionless beneath the dim lights. No one resisted. No one asked where they were being taken. An idea began to form in me, uncomfortable and slow. That place thrived more on obedience than on care. Longevity was not being offered freely. It was being traded for something unspoken. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I could not get the thought out of my head that my grandparents were part of a system feeding on the fear of growing old. By morning, determination replaced doubt, and I confronted a staff supervisor in the lobby, asking her directly what those procedures involved. Her answer was smooth and rehearsed, filled with vague phrases about regenerative therapies and cognitive preservation. When I mentioned that some residents did not remember basic details or repeated themselves, her tone changed just slightly, enough for me to notice. She reminded me that participation was voluntary and that extended life required commitment and sacrifice. That word again, sacrifice. It echoed louder than anything else she said. When I returned to the suite, Harold and June were already dressed, ready for another session they had not told me about. They insisted I should enjoy the facilities while I could, speaking as if time there were limited for visitors like me. Watching them walk away with their assigned escort, the distance between suspicion and certainty finally disappeared. I could not let everything end there, so I made one last attempt to reach them before leaving. I found Harold alone near the garden shortly before lunch. Up close, the changes were impossible to ignore. They were not dramatic, but deeply wrong in subtle ways. His gaze lingered 1 second too long before recognizing me, and his voice had a flat steadiness that did not belong to him. He talked about how aging was a choice people made when they stopped investing in themselves, repeating phrases I had heard in the promotional videos. When I asked if he was happy, he paused, searching for the word as if it had slipped out of his hands. June appeared beside him, gently guiding him away, thanking me for visiting with a politeness that felt practiced. Watching them walk together, I understood that they were no longer just residents. They were assets inside a system built to harvest hope and obedience. Before I left, I stopped by the front desk to formally check out, hoping someone might slip up and say something real. Instead, they handed me a brochure about future enrollment opportunities and told me visitors often reconsidered their stance after seeing the benefits firsthand. The implication was not subtle, and it left a bitter weight in my chest. As I waited for my ride beyond the gates, another group of new arrivals entered, laughing impressed, carrying suitcases full of trust. The staff welcomed them warmly, already beginning to fit them into the rhythm of rules and soothing promises. I wanted to warn them, to say something, anything. But every part of that place seemed designed to smother doubt before it could take root. Leaving felt less like a goodbye and more like an escape. Once I was home, I tried to convince myself that reporting the place would change something, but every attempt ran into a wall of legality and consent forms. Everything had been signed, approved, sterilized by language that hid consequences behind promises. My grandparents stopped answering calls after a while, and when they did respond, their messages were brief and strangely formal. They spoke of progress, clarity, commitment, words that sounded less and less like them. Months later, I received a letter informing me that visits were no longer recommended for the sake of their continued wellness. No explanation, just a polite farewell and a signature from someone I had never met. It felt as if I had been quietly erased from their lives. What stays with me now is not only the fear, but the understanding of how easy it is to guide people when the alternative is decline and loss. That community never needed chains or threats, only the promise of more time and the subtle erosion of choice. I still think about Harold's pause when I asked if he was happy, that brief emptiness where the truth almost surfaced. Whatever they do there, it works, at least on the surface, and that is the most unsettling part. The residents look alive, even vibrant, but something essential has been handed over in exchange. I do not know if my grandparents are still themselves. I only know they chose to stay, and the system made sure that choice became permanent.